And as you might know already, the idea of this class is to explore the first teachings of the Buddhist tradition as they're preserved in the Pali Canon. If you've not been to the last several classes, we've been exploring the Foundations of Mindfulness Sutta, the Satipatthana Sutta, as viewed through the lens of another teaching called the Sutta Sutta, referred to as the simile of the cook. And in this simile, the Buddha has us practitioners clue in to which of the many, many themes of mindfulness, our hearts and minds respond positively to, similar to how a good cook, clues into what flavors someone likes. And the idea is that if we clue into what themes our minds like, what themes of mindfulness our minds like, then our minds will settle into the practice, and we'll find practice to be beneficial and rewarding. This exploration of the simile of the cook has turned out to be basically a review of the Satipatthana, because that is what we serve up to our minds are the themes of mindfulness. And I'm going to share my screen for just a moment. So we have 4 Satipatthana, you might recall. In prior classes, we've made our way through the body, feelings of pleasure and pain, and aspects of the mind, of citta. In the last several classes, we have been covering the 5 hindrances, which is the first set of teachings in the 4th foundation, known as the Dhammas. And one thing I think it's important to note is that the 5 hindrances are the first set of teachings that the Buddha sets out in the 4th Satipatthana. They're followed by the 5 aggregates, by the 6 sense gates, the factors of awakening, and the 4 noble truths. As you can see, I'm highlighting portions of the email that I sent out a little earlier in the week. So in terms of, how we're to prioritize these teachings, what we should pay attention to in our practice, the way the list is set up, it's kind of telling us that the hindrances are something we should attend to right at the start. Okay. In fact, in some versions of the Satipatthana, there are just 2 teachings in the list. Those 2 teachings are the hindrances and the awakening factors. It's just those 2 in some of the other early versions of the Satipatthana. And as you might have heard before, the hindrances, in short, they hinder peace. They hinder our ability to see clearly. In one simile of the hindrances, they're compared to how a pool of water, can be full of dye, or can be bubbly, or full of moss, or the wind can cause ripples across the surface of the water, or the water can simply become cloudy. Otherwise the water is clear. And we're able to see clearly, what's in the water, the shells, the pebbles at the bottom, little fish swimming around. So again, technically, the 5 hindrances hinder our ability to bring the mind into a clear, calm, workable state, into samadhi and on into jhana. More generally, though, and it may be a little more interesting too, the 5 hindrances, I think, are great descriptions of the energetic qualities of mind that can give us a hard time. They're a good general description. And again, the hindrances are sense desire, aversion, sloth and torpor, restlessness and worry, and finally doubt. Now, back when I taught kids, back when I taught family meditation class, starting in the year 2000, one thing that I'd ask the kids to do at the beginning of each year, the beginning of each yearly session, was to have them think about what kinds of thoughts and emotions they seem to have a lot, or what kinds of thoughts and emotions that they saw a lot in people around them. Right. And then I'd ask them to write down those thoughts and emotions on little index cards. And I got to tell you, they came up with a lot of great and very interesting answers. And something that was a little bit of a double-edged sword is that the kids were very honest too. But just as an aside, in the 10 years that I taught kids, I found that I did not have to, quote unquote, dumb down anything. It was really just a matter of finding the vocabulary and kinds of imagery that they could relate to. Otherwise, I was teaching them all, everything that I could, everything that I knew, and they'd pick up on it. So anyway, after coming up with their lists of frequent thoughts and emotions, I'd then tape these pictures on the wall. So as you can see, it starts with peace, wisdom, and kindness, but in terms of the hindrances, I would tape these pictures on the wall: craving, aversion, restlessness, sloth, and confusion. Talk about them and compare them to these different kinds of animals: to a pig, a rooster, a monkey, sloth as a sloth, and confusion as a blind mole. I'd also talk about the peace, wisdom, and kindness, right? And then, just as I told you, I'd tell them that the 5 hindrances, they hinder peace, wisdom, and kindness. That's kind of how I would relate the two. Now, last thing, I'd ask the kids if any of the thoughts and emotions that they'd written down on the cards, if they seem to match up with any of these kinds of mind states. And then tape the note cards, under the various pictures that were on the wall. So 2 things that I really remember about this part of the class is that it gave families a vocabulary for describing their inner life. Gave them a vocabulary, and it allowed families to communicate with each other in a way that maybe they had not been able to before. Second, as everybody got to watch everybody else, tape all of their different kinds of thoughts and emotions, onto the wall, they were able to realize, oh, it's not just me, right? Everybody has this stuff going on. And in terms of the theme for today's class, comprehending the hindrances, it could be really helpful to be able to name this stuff, right? And not have our minds just be sort of a muddled, uncomfortable mess. This practice of noting, of clear awareness of what's arising, it helps us pop out of what I think of as confining bubbles of reality, that our minds concoct. But it's not just about naming and being clear about the problems, right? It's also about, naming the good stuff, being clear for ourselves, when something helpful is going on. Now, sometimes the helpful stuff can seem a little random, but one thing that the practice does is that it helps the helpful stuff become reliable, because, over time, peace, wisdom, and kindness are what our minds tend to value, tend to be what they gravitate to. So that's one thing. In addition to the hindrances themselves, another aspect of the Satipatthana that we've been exploring are the 5 inquiries that go with each of the hindrances. So here we are again. These are the 5 hindrances. These are the 5 inquiries right here. So we're to discern first if a hindrance is present or absent. We're to discern how each of the hindrances arises, and then how each is abandoned or kept at bay, and 5th, kept at bay. And if you were at our last class, you know that we realized, or that we focused on, the questions and concerns, the discomfort that may arise, with the idea of abandoning and keeping something at bay, of preventing something. These things, they arise in us, but because we might think we're being told to suppress parts of our being, parts of ourself, that can get a little weird. But if you missed the last class and that topic sounds interesting, that talk is posted on my IMCW webpage now. But for this morning, I'd really like to circle back and do something that I, might have, could have, should have done before. I spent a lot of time on the abandoning and preventing part. And that is to, focus on this first discernment here, these first couple of discernments. Is a hindrance present or is it absent? And as I said in my email reminder for today's class, I'd like to make this a little bit more of a practice-oriented session. So I'm gonna keep my comments brief, and we'll have some time for discussion. But I'd like to offer us a good amount of time to practice. So we'll focus on the hindrances. But another key part of what I'd like to do is offer up sort of an additional reflection that I've kind of come into in my own practice. And I think it naturally arises out of the first 2 inquiries here, the hindrances. So the first inquiry here is a hindrance present? And the reflection I'd like to add is that, well, if it's present, then, well, what is it exactly? And a great way to help us answer the question, what is it? Well, we find that in the very next section of the Satipatthana, right? The khandhas, or the aggregates. I really think that the khandhas are a perfect framework for helping us understand what the hindrances are. The basic idea is that each of the hindrances is made up of some mixture of the khandhas, of the aggregates, which are form, that is body, or the body, the eyes, ears, nose, and tongue. Vedana is the second, which is usually translated as feelings, but it refers to the sort of affective sense of pleasure and pain, or neither. The third khandha is perceptions, which are the mental labels that we apply to experience. And then finally, there's sankharas, which sometimes gets translated as basically just intentions or thought formations, but they include our thoughts and emotions, as well as our intentions, our volitional activities. And then finally, there's consciousness. The aggregate is consciousness. And there are 6 of them, actually, that occur at each of the 5 bodily senses, plus the mind has its own form of consciousness too. Set that one aside if you like. It gets a little complicated there, but so we have these 3 groups of 5, right? We have the 5 hindrances, we have the 5 inquiries with each, and we have the 5 aggregates. And it would be reasonable if at this point you're kind of thinking, oh my, and maybe there's a little resistance along the lines of, I want something a little easier than this, especially on a beautiful Saturday morning. But I sometimes joke to myself that, the first teachings and the way it lays out the path, it's not quite like going to a spa, where we walk in and somebody does a bunch of stuff to us to make us more relaxed and comfortable. Instead, the Buddha has us engage. So one of the important ways that we're intended to engage is to memorize the teachings, and to bring them to mind. And then at that point, we proactively keep the teachings in mind and use them as a lens for our experience. So that's what we'll be doing this morning, is working with these things in 3 different sessions of meditation practice. Before we dive into our meditation, are there any questions before we begin? No? All right. So for our meditation time, again, I'd like to offer 3 ways of contemplating the hindrances, of comprehending the hindrances. So first, we'll explore if any hindrances are present. Second, I'll invite you to bring to mind a hindrance that you'd like to work with. One that you maybe experience a lot, and then view that hindrance in terms of the aggregates. All right, so that's the second. The third session, and these will be probably 5 or 10 minutes each. We'll explore, what our experience is like when the hindrances are not present. The idea there is that we can better see what the hindrances are if we can appreciate what our experience is like when they're not there. Right? We have something better to compare to. So let's get started. And if you'd like to adjust your posture any, please feel free. Let your eyes close if you like. And you might take a nice deep in-breath and feel your body. Breathe out and relax. Again, breathe in deeply, feel your body come into a sense of uprightness, of alertness. And then breathe out and relax. Helping the body become a place that the mind would like to be. And so, right now in these moments, instead of being caught within any of the hindrances, the Satipatthana invites us to ironically bring them to mind and abide contemplating them, abide contemplating the hindrances. So that's what we'll do now is we'll note whether any of the five are here. You're experiencing any of them now or several. So first in this moment, notice if you have any felt sense of attraction, any felt sense of wanting, of an unhelpful wanting, kind of wanting that creates an imbalance. See if there's any presence of sense desire or craving. And then now, kind of like we're doing a body scan, we continue on to the second. We're doing a body scan of the mind, you might say, you might think. So next, do you feel any sense of aversion in any kind, any sense of wanting something to go away, wanting something to stop or to stay away? And again, you may experience this as some form of imbalance. Instead of leaning forward, you're leaning backward. So is attraction here? Is attraction present? Or is aversion present? Third, feel your way into whether there's any sense of excessive energy, of any kind of compulsive energy. The body feeling restless, really wanting to move, or the mind wanting to dart around and not settle in. So there might be a felt sense of excessive energy. On the other hand, you may sense an unhelpful lack of energy from the body feeling sleepy or very tired, or the mind feeling uninterested, unenthused. And then fifth and finally, notice if there's any presence of confusion, which may feel like fogginess or maybe being not quite sure what's going on. Can also feel like doubt or a sense of not trusting that this is a good way to spend your time. So in these moments, bring the hindrances to mind and be clear for yourself. Are they present? Are any present? Craving, aversion, restlessness, or torpor, or confusion. If the mind wants to get caught in any thought forms, start proliferating, see if it's related to any one of these hindrances, related to some sort of a desire, some sort of an aversion, general wanting to move. Or in these moments of quiet, you may notice that the mind starts to sink and go dark, slip into torpor. And if the mind is feeling confused, you can name it as such. You can be clear. Part of the mind can be clear, even as another part can be a little foggy and confused. So moving on to our second exercise. With this one, with the second one, I invite you to consciously bring the mind, become mindful of a hindrance you tend to experience a lot. Not anything traumatic, but just something you'd like to have a little more freedom around. The hindrance may be recent, maybe based on a difficult life situation you're currently confronting. Or it may be a little bit of a habit that you've gotten into, maybe a long time habit. Some way in which you typically hanker after something, person, a place, or a thing. Maybe some way in which you're habitually irritable or impatient. It might be that you're frequently feeling restless or anxious. Whatever it is, just bring something to mind that you'd like to be able to relate to a little better. Now, I invite you to, having become mindful of a particular hindrance, take some time to see what it's actually made of. Let's see how it's made up of body sensations, of feelings of pleasure and pain, perceptions, thoughts, different forms of consciousness, made of these aggregates, made of these 5 khandhas. So first, if you've been able to bring that hindrance to mind, how does the hindrance present itself in the body? What body sensations go along with it? Is it tightness, heat, heaviness? Maybe it's tingling, agitation. Does it show up in the breathing? As you breathe in and out, does it affect how you breathe? And then, are these sensations pervasive? Do you feel them throughout your entire body, or are there boundaries? Try to be clear how they might be limited to certain parts of the body and the other parts do not feel the hindrance. Something may show up in the breathing in the belly, which may be tight. Your hands may feel relaxed. So moving on to the second khanda, notice what sorts of pleasure or pain might be associated with the hindrance. This is something that might take a long time actually to explore. There might be multiple layers. But the question is, what particular kind of pleasure is the hindrance after, or might be after? Or what particular kind of pain might it be trying to avoid? Is it a pleasure in the body or is it a pleasure in the mind? Some hindrance might be after, or a pain in the body or a pain in the mind. Whatever it is, be clear about it. Be clear about what pleasure or pain the hindrance is concerned about. Next, moving on to the third khanda, which is perceptions. So here we can explore and be clear for ourselves, sort of mental labels come into play when this particular hindrance is active. What points of view are being applied when the hindrance is active? What ways might I be seeing things that are causing a hindrance to arise? And so forth, moving on to thoughts and emotions and intentions. Which of those ride with the particular hindrance? Take some moments to be clear for yourself. What particular, internal verbal chatter go along with a hindrance? What mental images get kicked up? What storylines does the mind concoct and get caught in? Be clear for yourself about the thoughts and the emotions that the hindrance creates rather than being caught within them. And then fifth aggregate is consciousness. And with this one, it can be helpful to remember that there really are an infinite number of things we could make ourselves self-conscious of, what we could bring into awareness. So the question we can ask ourselves, what is it I'm making myself conscious of such that I'm experiencing a hindrance, such that I'm making trouble for myself? So all of these are different ways using the aggregates to understand, to comprehend hindrances. Help us to not be controlled by them, to be dominated by them. And this can lead to us experiencing more and more gaps in between our experience of hindrances. And when they're not there, that becomes more common. We're free of them. And so for this third session in a sort of figure ground reversal, I invite you to notice what your experience is like when the hindrances are not present. Really focus in on the gaps. This is that second of the 5 inquiries. Notice when a hindrance is not present. So this noticing what your experience is like when the hindrances are absent, it helps us to be more clear about when the hindrances do arise and also what they are like once they have arisen, because we know the difference. So in these moments, the hindrances may be absent, or one or more may be present, but you're able to be clear that they're present. So you're not caught inside them. And then with this clear awareness, what the Buddha called sampajanya, part of your mind can be clear and composed, even when other parts of the mind are not clear and composed. Whichever is the case, look for the gaps, be clear about when the hindrances are absent or when you're not identifying with them. So again, we can use the aggregates to understand their absence. How does your body feel? And you might breathe in again right now. Breathe in, feel the body. Breathe out and relax the body. Feel your way into the absence of hindrances and notice what the body feels like. And then second, notice if there's any sense of pleasure, of immaterial pleasure. It comes from not being bothered by the hindrances. This is a kind of healthy pleasure. It's not something that comes from satisfying a craving. Instead, it's pleasure that comes from the mind being clear, settled, and composed. So really notice those moments of healthy pleasure when the mind is composed and settled. And then the third aggregate, applying that as a lens. Notice what sorts of perceptions come into play when you're not overcome by the hindrances. Instead of perceptions being unconscious and habitual, our perceptions can take the form of a helpful recognition, a helpful noting of what's happening. Our perceptions arise out of clear comprehension, and they support our understanding. And then related to this, moving on to the fourth aggregate, notice how your thoughts are when the hindrances are settled. Notice what your emotional life is like when the hindrances are absent. Thoughts may become wispy and light, voluntary rather than dominating. You can think and know that you're thinking rather than being caught inside thought forms and dragged around by them. See if that can be true for you right now. See if you can notice too the energy of pre-thoughts, you might say. Thoughts as they begin to arise. See if these are thoughts that will help you. If they're helpful, you can let them arise. If not, you can let them go. And in this way, your intentions become more easily skillful. And mixed in with all of this, emotionally, you may come into a kind of wakeful relaxation, a wakeful happiness. And in seeing this capacity for wakeful happiness within yourself, you come into a kind of confidence because you see that your happiness isn't dependent whatever pleasures that the world around you decides to grant or to take away. So, coming to an end of our practice session, notice if there are any hindrances present. You can notice what they're made of. You can be clear what your experience of life is like when they're absent. I'm familiar with those gaps, those periods. And the mind is peaceful, wise, and kind to itself. So I want to offer just a few more thoughts, and then we can open it up. Questions and comments. uh, just to say that over the years, one way that I've come to view working with the hindrances is that it's like learning to dive into waves at the beach. Dive into them, understand how they work and not get hurt by them. This can actually be kind of fun, in waves at the beach and also in our practice with the hindrances. Even in the midst of some hard stuff, it can be fun to feel like, you're learning something, gaining a skill, getting better at something. The hindrances over time can become more manageable, nameable, more discrete and finite rather than, dominating. We're able to disrupt their momentum, and not get dragged around by them, or dragged under the water by them. But as fun, as interesting as it can be to play in the waves, it can also be very rewarding, and it's actually a key part of the path, is to learn how to swim out beyond the waves, beyond the hindrances, get ourselves familiar with that territory too. get our minds and our hearts familiar with the calmer waters that are possible within us. Familiar with peace, wisdom, and kindness. Make that sort of the default. So that's really all I wanted to offer this morning. I want to thank you for your attention, for your participation in that long guided reflection. I hope it has been a good way to spend your time. So please, if there are any questions and comments, let's be great to hear from you. Yes, Roy, hi.
Hi, Carl. Thank you. There's a pain in my heart, and it relates to a current life circumstance, but it also resonates with much of my experience of living. And certainly I related to that as a hindrance. Being in that place is very different from going into a single pointed awareness with joy, And so I thought of that as a hindrance. Then as you prompted us through, what I noticed was that there are all other kinds of hindrances buzzing around it. Fear. That it'll never go away. Anxiety that at the root, this is because I'm a bad person. Which it's not. I mean, that's not it. But that comes up. At intervals, the body wanted to cry. At intervals, the body wanted to vomit. I mean, there was a kind of a nausea. And I have friends and I have a spouse, and I'll bring this to them. In a sense, that's the golden realization to come out of this, even if it's tangential to what you were doing. But the hindrances all buzzed around that. And I think, I'm called to accept that this is where this organism is. And that can't just be papered over or rejected or thrown away. Mm-hmm. It has to be lived through. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for being so honest with us about that, Roy. I'm reminded of one thing that came up in the question and answer period after our last class, and that was, this idea of inviting certain difficult stuff in. The tradition has us eventually get to the point where we let it go, but in order to be honest with ourselves, we've got to confront some very hard stuff up at the beginning and not pretend that it's not there. And it sounds like that's what you're doing. It's good that you have, sounds like, your spouse and your friends, there with you. That's another, I think, important part, and kind of like with the kids, realizing that, this is not a personal matter. This is, in a way, it's impersonal, right? It's the way these minds and these hearts act sometimes.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Yeah, I kind of brushed up against a little, when you brought us into the positive, a little contemplation of non-self. Mm-hmm. This non-self and some other non-selves. And the path is there. I'm not unique. This is simply just not unique. The truth is true. And that's the refuge for me. Thank you, Carl.
Yeah, and I'm not familiar with how practiced you are, so to speak, but maybe you are familiar with that confidence that can come about from maybe not having fully resolved this particular issue, but kind of come into an understanding that things can be let go of. I know I kind of know this path kind of shows me how to get to the point where I'm not tied up in knots. It's a transferable skill, you might say, right? But it can also be very freeing, as I kind of mentioned before, ironically, to be clear, even in the midst of it being very hard. Like you mentioned quickly how you had this sense of being, you might have said that I'm a bad person. You might have put it that way. In my own experience, I have found that if I stick with that, because sometimes that's a lot of what it is. It's very socially motivated. Some of the stuff we can bump up against. The Buddha said this time and again. Praise and criticism are huge. Self-praise, self-criticism, and externally, it can really bother us. And to just be clear and honest and courageous about that for ourselves can be a huge game changer, at least in my own experience. Anyway, thanks again, Roy. Yes, Misha, hi.
Hi, Carl. Thanks for today. What came up for me today has been present a lot lately. So I have a lot of the aversion. And generally what it is, I don't want to either be experiencing an emotion or a state that's actually present, something unpleasant, and or scary. And I'd rather stay in someplace relatively peaceful, even if it's not a meditative thing, have my attention elsewhere so I don't have to touch the difficult circumstances of my life. Let's see. So there was a question in there somewhere. Let's see. What was it? Yeah, I did find it helpful to do the to examine the hindrances in the forms of the aggregates, because that's something, that general approach is something that I found really helpful to bring to any of my experiences. Like even physical pain, because it's like, oh, well, it's not actually just pain. There's location, there's pressure, there's, is there a sharp sensation? I mean, it's just amazing how complex a thing that I used to call pain can be. So I guess.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just before I lose that train of thought, I want to kind of echo what you just said. It's this naming that can help us kind of put a frame around something, no matter what it is, whether it's a bodily sensation or a particular mental, whatever it is, so that it's not our entire reality. We're able to make it discrete rather than all encompassing. Anyway, please go on.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just stop there, but I'll just note that I've heard this phrase called "name it to tame it," and then I also heard another way of saying it, of "name it to frame it." So that was just really a helpful reminder to me. So it's like, if I'm trying to meditate, which I'm averse to right now because I don't want to experience things, unpleasant things, it's like try to stay with the hindrances, but then it moves into sadness, grief. It's like, oh, even that, I can name it. You know, if I can't stay with the focus of that I've chosen, you know, then isn't that basic insight meditation? Then if something strong is presenting itself, then I can shift my attention there. And then I can also name it, you know, note the characteristics, 3 characteristics or whatever. Thanks.
And as some of you are probably aware too, it's helpful not to, you know, to deal with these things in a way that we're able to absorb them, you know, not putting ourselves in a position of, you know, trying to drink water out of a fire hose, right? Give ourselves, you know, do it a little by little, you know, learn gently, you might say. Yeah. Thank you, Misha.
Carl, I'd like to say something. This is Ralph.
Yes.
I apologize. First, my Zoom is no longer detecting my camera, so I can't turn that back on. But I was thinking about the hindrance of doubt, which can be a little subtle, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Frequently comes up as a doubt in the Dharma, but there's all kinds of doubt out there. It can be self-doubt about, am I strong enough to handle this? Am I smart enough? It can be doubt in the beneficence of the world. You know, are other people going to be understanding and kind, or are they going to be judgmental and harsh? You know? And all these little doubts can underlie all kinds of other, you know, make you anxious and restless, and you know, and it sort of, I've frequently seems to sort of hide in the background. But when you start taking apart the hindrances, you can find a little doubt in, you know, about your ability to get through something. Mm-hmm. I sort of hear this in what other people are saying, and you know, I one thing that gets me through that is thinking, you know, I've come this far, I must be doing something right. You know? Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to say, you know, I've been working with the idea of doubt a little bit lately, and trying to push back on it a little, which I think takes us back to a little what you said last week. I'm not repressing things, but you do have to push back on them a little to work with them. You know, let them come through sometimes and then push back on them other times. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
question the reality they're trying to
exactly
present to you.
That's it.
Yeah. I find, Ralph, I find doubt one of the most interesting ones too, because it I think, like you said, it can kind of hide underneath some other sorts of things, like I really should get off the cushion and be doing something else. Mm-hmm. You know, in that sense, it's doubting that the practice is really what I ought to be doing. And sometimes, honestly, you know, if the baby is crying in the other room, you know, it's not a matter of doubt that you should go up and tend to the baby, you know. But it can be sort of an undercutting of doubt, can be sort of an undercutting of our trust that the practice is going to do us any good. But yeah, there are multiple ways that it manifests, I think, more than any of the other hindrances. Yes, Kathleen, hi.
Since somebody brought it up, I realized as we were going through this exercise that humming brings me wakeful happiness. Just that. Mm-hmm.
This was a lot to go through. I appreciate your hanging in there with this. It might not be a kind of exercise that you found maybe helped in this little half-hour period that we did it, but maybe it's something that you can play around with a little bit more on your own. I don't know. I've never seen that the hindrances and the aggregates are connected in the way that I connect them, but it wouldn't surprise me if it is, just because of the way it's paired in the Satipatthana. To me, it's such an obvious. There's such an obvious connection between the two, and I think they're a very helpful complement to each other, I think. Yes, Emily, hi.
Hi. It was really interesting to perceive the hindrances in this way. I did get lost after going through the forms, the pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, the perceptions, and then the sankharas, and
Consciousness.
Consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, separating consciousness from the form, because it's taste, smell. I mean, to me, that is synonymous with nose and tongue. And, if I'm going to think about the form of taste, I'm going to be drawn to my tongue. Mm-hmm. So it got a little murky for me.
And that they're kind of interrelated. Yeah.
Yeah, they just kept. And in fact, I couldn't even remember what consciousness was by the end. But as I pressed on, I guess, I'm sure with practice it would be more evident, but I wasn't. Yeah, have you got anything that might clarify consciousness on this?
Yeah, like I quickly mentioned, there are, in Buddhism, there are 6 different kinds of consciousness. Right? There's the consciousness related to tactile sensations of the body, eye, ear, nose, tongue, and then mental. So that's the 6th form of consciousness. And interestingly, it's not one kind of consciousness that views them all. They come in and out of play very quickly. So it can seem to be sort of one continuous form of consciousness, but they're actually different kinds that are broken up. And I don't know if this is interesting or helpful, but they kind of, consciousness is sort of it's a sort of raw capability at each sense gate, each of the 6 sense gates. So you might want to see if you can walk and chew gum at the same time, but notice that you can't actually feel the body walking and taste the gum in the exact same moment. There's a toggling. And, that might be interesting technically, but I think that, at least for me, the power behind that insight is that what we're bringing into consciousness helps determine our reality. And we can guide ourselves into being conscious of things that help us more rather than give us a hard time. I hope that helps. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. And then just to note, we're kind of wrapping up here for the next class, October 1st. I'll be getting a little bit more into the khandas, just focusing on the khandas, but really focusing on the teachings in which the Buddha points out how we get into trouble when we cling to them, when we view the khandas as I, me, or mine. So it's going to be really focused on the teaching of non-self, anatta. Which again, if you're up for a really wild Saturday morning, I invite you to come back in 2 weeks.
So we're going back to the first of the week, first of the month for these classes.
Yes. Is there anything else, anybody? So again, I really appreciate everybody hanging in there with this. I know this is not a walk in the park, but in the end, I hope helpful. Okay. Does that feel done, everybody? Okay. Thanks very much.